Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and if I'm being a little bit quiet, it's because it's late at night, and theoretically I'm supposed to record this tomorrow during normal hours like a normal person, but I was sitting up reading this passage, and I was like, you know what? This is really interesting, and I think we should do it now, because it's been like a week since we hung out anyway, so rock and roll, here we go. Let me tell you something that never brought the best out in me, and that was people yelling at me when I was growing up. Sorry, that was a little too loud. Sometimes the coaches or teachers would think they would get better stuff out of me with the drill sergeant routine, but I would be like, I don't need that right now. What I need is like support if you tell me stuff's going to be okay. And when I go on the Twitters and everybody's yelling about stuff to make their point, I don't really enjoy that very much. And when the politicians, they yell about things, they tell everybody how awful they are, and it's really judgy, it's just not my favorite thing. I don't enjoy that. I like the more genteel approach. I think it does get better things out of people. But what we get going here in Matthew chapter 12 is we're seeing this really weird ratio compared to how we do things now between the level of certainty a character feels about something, or an actual level of certainty. I got my left hand way up in the air for how certain we are. And then over here with my right hand, real down, real low, the ratio is between the level of certainty we feel about how sure we are about stuff and how right we are about stuff versus how much we're going to yell at everybody else and guilt them and shame them and cause a ruckus about things. And the ratio between those two things that I see being more and more common all the time is very low level of rightness over here with the one hand and very high level of yelling about things. It's almost like the yelling covers up the not necessarily rightness. But with Jesus, you have rightness through the roof. Like, he's been right about everything. Look at this. I mean, look, you might not think that the Bible is accurate or from God, but as the text holds out Jesus, he just keeps looking good and honorable and noble, and he's describing this kingdom that seems way better, and he's doing stuff to make people's lives better, and he's never the one who's escalating things. He's not being stupid and petty. It just seems like demonstrably, even if we just go with the character on the page, he is held out as being right and handling his business well and being in control. He's so dang chill for being held out as being so dang right about everything. So we've been talking about this ratcheting tension, this business that started after the Sermon on the Mount. The more cool stuff Jesus does, the more certain people are like, yeah, I'm not really into it. This messes with my things for a whole lot of different reasons that we've discussed previously in other episodes. That tension ratchets between Jesus and the religious leaders of the day to a new degree of intensity over what you're supposed to do or not do on the Sabbath. Doesn't seem like that big a deal to you and me, but as we discussed last week or whenever, it's a pretty big deal for the people there. And so Jesus heals a guy on the wrong day of the week, and the Pharisees, instead of being like, that was, I mean, you got to give him that. It was pretty neat. I mean, that guy's arm was like all rotted off and screwed up and stuff, and then you fix it. Like, yeah, I mean, you got to at least tip your hat. They go straight to let's murder him. And so Jesus does this strategic withdrawal. Matthew 12, verse 15, aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. Many followed him, and he healed all their sick, warning them not to tell who he was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. We'll get to the spoken through the prophet Isaiah thing in just a minute. So what we have here is a pretty interesting move. I mean, you think about the most socially mature people you know in life. One of the things that they will all have in common, go ahead and picture them right now, is that almost always this isn't the hill they're going to die on. Now, part of what makes these people virtuous is that occasionally there is a hill they're willing to die on. And if we just plug Jesus into that equation, most of the time, this isn't the hill he's willing to die on, because literally there is a hill coming up later that is the one he definitely is intending to die on. But until then, we just ain't doing that. So he withdraws. And as he withdraws, he continues to do more of the redemptive good things that he's been doing all along. It seems to reflect really well on him, especially when contrasted with the whole, we're going to murder you because you made somebody's life better on the wrong day of the week thing than we saw in the previous passage. But here is where this little chunk of Matthew 12 gets weird. And I notice that a lot of people get to this passage and they get pretty confused. There's not unanimity on what to make of this. And here's where it gets confusing. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. And then what we get next is straight out of Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he leads justice to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope. Okay, now anytime we get one of these verbal cues that you and I have talked about, that Matthew gives us, where he's necessarily connecting the next thing with the previous thing, whenever we see those verbal cues, we got to go way out of our way to make sure that we resist the temptation to interpret the next three sentences just in light of whatever feels good at the moment. It's not meant to be interpreted that way. It's not some universal principle that happens in a vacuum. When Matthew gives us a cue, like the one that we talked about before, which is, at that time, that means you got to look at the thing before. Or even more overtly here, this thing I just got done saying was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. We got to look back at that. Okay, common sense, but hear me out on this. So we start reading this thing, and it says, here's my servant whom I've chosen, the one I love and whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. Okay, so it looks like this whole stage then in the mission is from God. This whole thing is empowered, informed, fueled by the Spirit. So this whole thing is not from Satan or demons or anything like the other side is saying. It's clearly from God, and it's clearly in keeping with the big promise that God made to Abraham all the way back in the day, the thing about how God is going to make Abram into this great nation, and you will be a blessing to the nations. The nations will be blessed through you. So all of that is packed right in there. I mean, just this first verse of the prophecy we're referencing back to here covers a ton of the big story, but it doesn't really answer my question. How does that statement of the big picture of what God is doing and justice for the nations, how does that have anything to do with the strategic withdrawal, this part of the narrative that we just read two verses about this is supposed to fulfill? Well, that becomes more clear as we get to verse 19. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. So he's not going to do the yelling. He's not going to do the thing that is so common these days where you sort of think something through kind of 1/8 of the way, and then you burn down anyone who doesn't already get the thing that you just figured out very recently. He's not pulling that immature stunt. He's not going to go out in the streets and throw a fit and make a great big stupid spectacle about the whole thing. He's going to be gentle instead. Who does that? It's so strange and bizarre and disorienting. Listen to this next part. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. I remember the first time I really thought about this passage, it was hard to know what to do with that language, right? Okay, bruised reed, not going to break it, smoldering wick, won't snuff it out. Oh, maybe this is a reference back to some of those prophecies about like the stump that's burned out and you get the shoot of Jesse, like it's this little glimmer of hope coming out of the other stuff. And there's some similarities in that language, but the context doesn't really support that interpretation. So, okay, maybe we put that one aside. And I thought, well, Greek doesn't have punctuation the way we have punctuation in English. Maybe there should be some semicolons in here. And it's like a bruised reed, but he will not break. Oh, so you could cheat here to make it sound like he is the bruised reed or he is the smoldering wick. But, he's resilient. He won't break. He won't snuff out. But that doesn't neatly tie back in to what we just saw. No, what neatly ties back in is that the Pharisees are murderous and angry and willing to do ugly things in front of everybody. And Jesus, even under duress, just isn't going to do that kind of stuff. He continues to not just be willing to be the bigger man and step back from conflict for the sake of much, much bigger good things. He also cares about the most vulnerable. And I think that's how we read this verse 20. A bruised reed? We're talking about something that's been blown in the wind. Its stem integrity has been compromised to the point that the slightest gust is now going to snap that thing over and effectively kill it. A smoldering wick, like there's no flame left. I picture the guy desperately in the woods trying to light a fire and he's got one match left and there's a tiny little bit of blue flame left on that thing and he's nurturing it and cupping it with both hands because it's the last shot at that thing turning into any kind of useful warming fire. And Jesus, if he was a bull in a china shop who didn't care about any collateral damage, and I'm here to say my thing and you will hear me and I will get likes and retweets, He would just bulldoze these people. You come into his room, you say the wrong thing, boom, take that, sucker. But instead, he's different from other people on a mission. He cares about the collateral damage. And so he's not only not yelling at people, but he's proactively caring for people. Right now, Jesus is in the mode where he's communicating this thing and living it out in keeping with the kingdom values and in keeping with the stuff he's been saying about himself and that we've been seeing in him all along. This spirit of gentleness and care and compassion and not burning it down and flipping over the cars in the streets is reflected in the last verses of chapter 11 that we just looked at recently. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble of heart, and you'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This is different than the angry, hostile revolutionary or the person who shouts you down. I think that this quote in Matthew from Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, is a prophecy fulfilled in 3 ways. Most of all, Jesus is gentle and humble in heart and gives rest for the weary soul. People weren't thinking that that's what they were going to get in a Messiah. They pictured a lot more anger, a lot more rage, a lot more violence. What Matthew is doing here is deftly pointing out, just as Jesus deftly pointed out to John the Baptist's disciples 1 chapter earlier, from exactly the same chapter in Isaiah, that the scriptures, that the prophets, that the Old Testament don't point to your angry, militaristic, burn it down, explode through the wall, Kool-Aid Man style Messiah. They point to exactly this kind of Messiah. Also, in a wider sense, there's language at the beginning of this prophecy and at the end of this prophecy that indicates that this is going to go beyond his own ethnic people group and out to the Gentiles. And third, this prophecy also demonstrates that everything Jesus is doing is on mission, is on plan, is fueled by God, is fueled by the Spirit. My in-laws are sleeping upstairs. My kids are sleeping directly above me through that vent. And I think my wife is asleep in the next room. Hopefully I've been quiet enough. Thank you for late night 10-minute Bible hour podcasting with me. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.